everyone. So today we are going to see about the cardiac cycle. So the objectives of today's video are the atrial cycle, the ventricular cycle, the events during the cardiac cycle. We're going to see some points about the jugular venous pulse and the heart sounds, in which the heart sounds can be separately asked as 5 mark. The jugular venous pulse can also be asked as a 5 mark separately. The cardiac cycle can asked as an SC. And okay, so let's get into today's topic. So what is cardiac cycle? So the events that occur during each heartbeat, during each heartbeat in the heart is known as the cardiac cycle. So how are we gonna put that into sentence? So the cyclic events that takes place in the heart during each heartbeat. So let's derive the duration of the cardiac cycle from this sentence. During each heartbeat. So when we consider that a normal or an average heartbeat will be around 75 beats per minute, we have 60 seconds in a minute. So 60 divided by 75 gives us 0.8 seconds. So the duration of a cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds. Okay. Now, when the heart rate increases, that is when the denominator increases, what happens? The value decreases, right? So the duration of the cardiac cycle is shortened. But when the heart rate decreases, but when the heart rate decreases, the duration of the cardiac cycle is prolonged. Now, what are the events in the cardiac cycle? We have the atrial cycle and the ventricular cycle, which occur simultaneously, in both right and the left side of the heart. So what does this atrial cycle consist of? It has atrial systole and the atrial diastole. So we saw that the duration of the cardiac cycle was around 0.8 seconds, right? So when we break that, the atrial systole comprises of 0.1 second and atrial diastole comprises 0.7 seconds. Now the ventricular cycle also has ventricular systole and diastole, right? So the ventricular systole comprises 0.3 second and ventricular diastole comprises 0.5 second. Okay. Now, about the atrial cycle, so the atrial cycle, the atrial systole will be followed by the atrial diastole, and both the right and the left atrial cycle occur simultaneously. Now let's see about the atrial systole. So the duration of the atrial systole, as we saw in the earlier slide, it was 0.1 second. So what does systole means? It means the contraction, right? So atrial systole means contraction of the atria. So what happens when the atria contracts? It causes increased intra-atrial pressure. So when the intra-atrial pressure increases, that causes a wave of JVP. So JVP is nothing but the jugular venous pulse or pressure. So which is highly or closely related to that of the intra-atrial pressure curve. So A wave is a positive wave of the jugular venous pulse, which we'll see in the forthcoming slides. So the intra-atrial pressure causes the intra-atrial pressure increases during atrial systole. So that causes the A wave of the JVP. What else does this atrial systole cause? We have heart sounds, right? So we have fourth heart sound, which is because of this atrial systole. Now, during this atrial systole, the atria contracts. So the contents of the atria will be will pass to the ventricle, right? So the blood from the atria to the ventricle, that contributes to around 20 to 30% of the ventricular filling. Now let's see about the atrial diastole. So the atrial diastole duration is around 0.7 second, right? What does diastole mean? It means relaxation, right? So both the atria are relaxed. What happens when the atria is relaxed? So the atria gets filled with the blood. When the atria is getting filled with the blood, the pressure on the atria increases. That leads to an increased pressure, right? So so what does that cause? It causes an D wave, which is also a positive wave of the JVP. So during this atrial diastole, 70 to 75% of the ventricular filling takes place. Now let's come to the ventricular cycle. So in ventricular cycle, we also have ventricular systole and diastole, right? So first, let's see about the ventricular systole. We saw in the earlier slide, the duration was around 0.3 second, right? So a point here is that the right ventricular systole starts earlier than that of the left ventricular systole. Now this ventricular systole is divided. It has three subphases. As we can see here, it's isovolumetric contraction, rapid ejection phase, and slow ejection phase. Okay, so the duration of each of these are 0.05 second. I mean, the duration of isovolumetric contraction is 0.05 second. Rapid ejection phase, I mean, the duration is around 0.1 second, and slow ejection phase, the duration is 0.15 second. So when we add this, the total sum is around 0.3 second. So firstly, let's see each phases one by one. First, let's concentrate on this isovolumetric contraction. So let's break the word. What is that? Isovolumetric contraction. Since this is a subphase of the systole, yeah, obviously contraction is the contraction of the ventricle. But what is these two words? That is iso and volumetric denotes. The iso means same, right? So the volume of the, the volume of blood in the ventricle remains same. Yeah. So that denotes isovolumetric contraction. Even when the ventricle contracts, the volume and the volume of blood in the ventricle remains same. Okay. So that is the meaning of this phase. Okay. So why is it same? Why does the volume not change? Why? Because the valves, AV valves, okay, so they are closed, okay, because of this. Okay, so since the isovolumetric contraction means there is no change, okay, the ventriculars are contracting as a closed chamber. Because of that, we have no change in volume, right? So when the ventricle contracts as a closed chamber, we have an increase in pressure, intraventricular pressure, okay. So what happens? So due to this increased intraventricular pressure, the AV valves close. Okay. So what happens when the AV valves close? The AV valve closure causes the first heart sound, which is the lub, right? So the first heart sound occurs during the isovolumetric contraction phase. This is the point here. Then what's next? Okay. So the AV valves are closed, but the intraventricular pressure keeps on rising. So what happens? So the AV valves budge into the atria, right? So the AV valves will be budging into the atria, right? Okay. So this is the AV valve, right? So this AV valves are closed. Okay. Now what happens when the pressure keeps on rising? When the pressure keeps on rising, the AV valves budge into the atria. Okay. That causes an increased intra-atrial pressure that results in the C wave of the jugular venous pulse, which is also a positive wave, okay, of the jugular venous pulse. Okay. Now, let's come to the next phase. It is the rapid ejection phase. The duration is 0.1 second. Okay, what does this phase mean? Let's just break this word again. Rapid ejection. So the blood is being rapidly ejected from the ventricle. Okay. Okay, so when the intraventricular pressure increases, okay, and it just reaches its threshold or its peak value, okay, what happens? The blood gets ejected, right? So 70% of the stroke volume is being ejected at this phase, that is during the rapid ejection phase. Yeah. So during this rapid ejection phase, the ventricular pressure increases. How? So the left ventricular pressure rises up to 120 millimeter of mercury, and the right ventricular pressure increases up to 25 millimeter of mercury. Okay. Now let's come to the next phase. It's the slow ejection phase. Okay. The blood is being ejected, but at a slower rate than that of the rapid ejection phase. That's what it means, right? Okay. Now as the blood is being slowly ejected, the intraventricular pressure drops. Okay, it starts to decline. Okay. Now the remaining 30% of the stroke volume is being ejected at this phase. Okay. Now we have a term here called the end systolic volume. Okay. Let's break that word to end systolic volume. The volume at the end of the systole is called the end systolic volume, right? So during this ventricular systole, okay, around 80 millimeter of the blood is being ejected from the ventricle, right? So there will be around, there will be some remaining blood in the ventricle, right? So that is around 50 millimeter. Okay. So the 50 milliliter of blood that is left at the ventricle at the end of the systole is called the end systolic volume. Okay. So this comprises the ventricular systole. Now let's move on to ventricular diastole. Okay. So this ventricular diastole is, it's divided into 5 subphases. Okay. And the duration of the ventricular diastole is 0.5 second. Okay. Now, pro to diastole, isovolumetric relaxation, first rapid filling phase, slow filling phase, and last rapid filling phase. These are the 5 subphases of the ventricular diastole. Let's see these phases one by one. So first, let's see about the protodiastole. The duration is around 0.04 second. Okay. So at this phase, this is the just the beginning of the ventricular diastole. That means the ventricular systole has just ended. So at this phase, the ventricle stops contracting. Okay. So when the ventricle stops contracting, the semilunar valve closes, right? So the closure of the semilunar valve causes the second heart sound, right? So the dub sound, that is the closure of the semilunar valve, causes the second heart sound that occurs during this protodiastole phase. Okay. Now let's move on to the next phase. It is the isovolumetric relaxation. So as we have already seen isovolumetric contraction there earlier, here it's isovolumetric relaxation. That means the ventricles are relaxing, but the volume of blood in the ventricle remains same. Okay, why? Because the ventricle keeps relaxing as a closed chamber. Okay, so when the ventricles keeps relaxing, the intraventricular pressure drops, right? Now, the AV valves, okay, open at the end of this isovolumetric relaxation. Okay, now what is the next phase? We have the first rapid filling phase. Okay, so the duration is around 0.11 second. Okay, now what does this mean? Okay, the name itself is self-explanatory. That is, the blood rapidly fills into the ventricle, but that's the first step. That means we also have another rapid filling phase. Yeah, so the rapid filling of blood from the atria to the ventricle. Okay, that's what happened in this phase. Yeah, okay. So during this phase, because of the rapid flow of blood from the atria into the ventricle, there occurs some vibration in the ventricle. Okay, so that results in the third heart sound. Okay, now during this phase, okay, around 70% of the ventricular filling takes place. Okay, as the blood is being rapidly ejected from, and the blood is being rapidly flows from the atria to the ventricle, 70% of the ventricular filling takes place. So when the blood flows from the atria to the ventricle, we have a slight increase in the intraventricular pressure. Okay. Now, next, what do we have? We have the slow filling phase. The duration is around 0.19 second. Okay. So what happens? The ventricle keeps filling, but at a slower rate compared to that of the first rapid filling phase, right? So there will be okay. So the remaining part of the blood keeps filling at this phase, right? So around 5 to 10% of the ventricular filling takes place at this phase. Next, we have the last rapid filling phase, yeah, which comprises of 0.1 second. So at the end of this phase, okay, so the ventricular filling is completed. So this last rapid filling phase coincides with that of the atrial systole, yeah, okay. As if we can remember, if we can just recollect, we saw that the atrial systole contributes to around 20 to 30% of the ventricular filling, right? So the remaining blood left in the atria, okay, that gets pumped out from the atria because of the atrial systole, okay, and that gets emptied into the ventricle during this last rapid filling phase, okay. So the last rapid filling phase coincides with that of the atrial systole. Yeah, so atrial systole, right? So this is the end of the diastole, right? So the amount of blood that is left in the ventricle at the end of the diastole is called the end diastolic volume, which is around 130 milliliter. So these are the events that occur in the cardiac cycle. Let's have a quick recap. See, the atria contracts, okay, and then we have the ventricular contraction, which has isovolumetric contraction, and then the ventricular ejection. Okay, then we have the ventricular relaxation. Okay, isovolumetric relaxation, and then we have the ventricular filling, and the cycle repeats. So we saw these in a detailed manner. Okay. Now, what are the pressure changes that occur during the cardiac cycle, and how can we calculate that? Okay, so there are some pressure changes that occur during this cardiac cycle, right? So how can we calculate? There are two methods, okay? So one is manometer, which is used in experimental animals. So the manometer is directly connected to the heart and the blood vessels, and the pressure changes can directly be recorded. Okay, but this is used only in animals, that is for experimental purpose. The next is the cardiac catheterization. Okay, so this was done in human. Okay, the catheter was passed into the heart through the femoral vein to the right atrium. Okay, and then the pressure was being monitored. Okay, now let's see the pressure changes in the ventricle. Okay, so as we saw earlier, the ventricle has two phases, ventricular systole and ventricular diastole, right? So this phase, okay, until this phase, it corresponds to the ventricular systole, and from this phase till this phase, it contributes to the ventricular diastole. As we can see here, during ventricular systole, the intraventricular pressure increases, and during ventricular diastole, the interventricular pressure decreases or drops very steeply. Okay, now the first phase. Okay, so during isovolumetric contraction, why is the pressure increased there? Because the ventricle contracts as a closed chamber, right? So there is a steep increase in pressure. Okay, then during the rapid ejection phase, okay, the ventricle is contracting with a very maximum force. Okay, so the pressure increases during this rapid ejection phase. Okay, so the pressure during this rapid ejection phase may vary from 90 millimeter of mercury to 140 millimeter of mercury. Okay, then we have the slow ejection phase, right? So during the slow ejection phase, the pressure starts decreasing, right? Next, we have the ventricular diastole. First, what do we have? We have the protodiastole, right? So during this protodiastole, the pressure starts falling very gradually, and during this isovolumetric relaxation, there is a steep fall in the ventricular pressure. And then during inflow of blood, we have increase in blood. Okay, so we have increase in pressure, but that is not very, it's very minor. But when we see in this diagram, we can see that the pressure during the inflow, okay, so during the filling phase, okay, it's almost like it's same. Okay, but the rise in the interventricular pressure is there, but it's very minute and minimum. So at the end, okay, so there occurs atrial systole, which coincides with the last rapid filling phase, right? So there we have a slight increase in pressure. Okay, the pressure varies from around 4 to 12 millimeter of mercury. Yeah, this is the same diagram. Okay, so this diagram is called the Vickers diagram. So at the end of this video, when we combine the graphs which we see throughout this video, that finishes this Vickers diagram. So it's nothing complicated. So we just saw this graph now. Okay, now let's have a quick recap on this graph. What happens during this phase? Okay, we have isovolumetric contraction. Okay, we have ejection from the ventricle. So up to here, we have the ventricular systole. From here, we have the ventricular diastole. So protodiastole occurs, isovolumetric relaxation occurs, we have rapid inflow here, okay, and then we have diastasis, or the slow filling phase. It's also called diastasis. Okay, then we have the atrial systole here, which contributes to a slight increase in the intraventricular pressure. Yeah, that's all. Now let's see about the intraatrial pressure curve. So this intraatrial pressure curve can be asked as a Feynman because, okay, so before that, we'll see about the jugular venous pulse. So the pressure that changes in the right atrium are very closely related to that of the internal jugular vein. Why? Because the right atrium pressure is transmitted to the internal jugular vein because it has no valve, okay, between the opening of the superior vena cava and the right atrium. So when they ask jugular venous pulse or pressure, you can just write the intraatrial pressure changes as such. Okay, so how do we measure this jugular venous pulse? It's measured using a polygraph. Okay, now let's see about this intraatrial pressure curve. What do we have? So this is the intraatrial pressure curve. As we can see here, we have 3 positive waves and 2 negative waves. What are those positive waves? It's A, C, and B. And what are the negative waves? It's X and Y. So A, what is this A? So it's the first positive wave. As we can see here, when does this occur? This occurs during the atrial systole. Okay, So so atrial systole, just remember that A. So what happens? There is an increase in intra-atrial pressure, right? So the right atrial pressure may rise. I mean, it may reach to a peak of 5 millimeter of mercury, whereas the left atrial pressure may reach to a peak of 8 millimeter of mercury. Now, what do we have next? We have the C wave. It's the second positive wave, right? So this C wave occurs during the isovolumetric contraction. So during isovolumetric contraction, if you can remember, we said that the atrioventricular valve bulges into the atria because of the because the ventricle as it's being contracted in a closed chamber, right? So that causes an increased intra-atrial pressure, right? So because of that, we have the C wave. So when does the C wave occur? During isovolumetric contraction. So C for contraction. Okay. So next, what do we have? We have X wave. Okay. When does this X wave occur? It occurs during the ejection phase. So when the blood flows from the atria to the ventricle, there is obviously a fall in pressure, right? So that causes the X wave. Okay. Now, what about this V wave? So this V wave, okay, this is the third positive wave, right? So during the during the atria, when it fills with blood, there occurs an increased intra-atrial pressure, right? So during that phase, we have this V wave or the third positive wave. What about this Y wave then? So when the atrioventricular valve opens, the blood rushes from the atria into the ventricle. That causes a fall in intra-atrial pressure. So that results in the Y wave. Okay. So when they ask us a jugular venous pulse of pressure, this is what we are supposed to draw, and we are supposed to explain about each of these waves and why are they occurring. Okay, this is just the same. Yeah. Now let's see about the ECG. Okay. So they are P, Q, R, S, and T waves, and we are going to see why are these waves occurring. So when the atria is being filled with blood, there occurs P wave. I mean, the P wave starts occurring, and when the atria contracts, the P wave, the P wave drops. Okay, so the P wave is due to the contraction of the atria. Now, what do we have? We have the QRS complex, right? So it's due to the ventricular contraction. Okay, then we have the T wave. Yeah, so the T wave is because of the ventricular, the ejection of blood from the ventricle. Okay. Now we're going to see about the heart sounds. Okay, so we have 4 heart sounds, out of which the first and the second heart sounds are very important and can be clinically heard. Okay, so let's see about this heart sounds. So the first heart sound, also known as S1, right? Okay, so why does that occur? It occurs due to the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Okay, what does that denote? It denotes the beginning of the ventricular system. Okay, what are the characteristics of this first heart sound? So it's a very low pitch sound and it's a lub sound. Okay, low pitch in the sense the frequency is around is less than 50 hertz. Okay, now what is the type of sound? We can hear the sound continuously and it's very audible, not like the third and the fourth heart sounds, right? So it's a continuous audible sound. What is its duration? It lasts for around 0.14 to 0.17 seconds. Okay, where can we hear the first heart sound? The first heart sound is audible all over the chest, okay, but we can hear that better over the tricuspid and the mitral valves. Okay, what does this first heart sound coincides with? It coincides with the R wave of the ECG, the carotid pulse, and the apex beat. Okay, now let's move on to the second heart sound. So why is the second heart sound? Why is it caused? It's because of the closure of the semilunar valves, right? Okay, so what is it? When the semilunar valve closes, what does that denote? It denotes the beginning of the ventricular diastole, right? Then what about the characteristic? It's a high pitched sound and a dub sound. Okay, so high pitched in the sense the frequency is greater than 50 hertz. Okay, what is the type of sound? It's a split sound. Okay, so it's like why is it split? Because we have the aortic, the aortic valve closure and the semilunar valve closure, right? The pulmonary valve closure, right? So both of these closure, that if it doesn't coincide, we can hear that as a split sound. Okay. So what's the duration? It lasts for around 0.1 to 1.4 seconds. Okay. So where can we hear that? It's also audible all over the chest, but we can hear that better at the aortic and the pulmonary areas. Okay, what does it coincide with? It coincides with the T wave of the ECG and V wave of the JVP. Okay, now the next is the third heart sound. So why is this third heart sound produced? The third heart sound is produced by the vibration of the ventricular blood. What? When the blood flows from the atria into the ventricle during the first rapid filling phase. Okay. Next, what is the characteristic? It's very low pitch. Usually, it's not audible. Okay. Then the type of sound. Okay. So in around 30% of the children and young adults, we can hear this third heart sound. Okay. What is the duration? So it lasts less than 0.1 second. Okay. So where can we hear this? In the people, I mean, in 30% of children and young adults, we can hear this all over the, all over the heart, right? Then the correlation, as we saw here, it coincides with the first rapid filling phase. Yeah. Next is the fourth heart sound. Okay, what causes this fourth heart sound? The atrial systole. Okay, during the last rapid filling phase of the ventricle causes the fourth heart sound. Okay, what is the character of this heart sound like? It's very low pitch. It's usually not audible, right? Okay, so it's completely inaudible even in children. Okay, but it can be recorded from all the four areas of our chest. Okay, now what does it correlate with? It correlates with the second rapid filling phase of the ventricular filling, and it also coincides with the A wave of the JVP. Now, this is the diagram, okay? This is called the Vickers diagram. So when we just combine all those graphs that we saw in this video, that gives you this whole diagram. Yeah. So this is the intraventricular pressure change. This is the intra-atrial pressure change. This is the ECG. And this is called the phonocardiograph, which denotes the heart sounds. Okay. Thank you.